Tonight, we journey to the place where America's future hung suspended like Spanish moss from ancient cypress trees, to the crescent city that guarded the mouth of the continent's greatest river, to the morning when a ragged army of frontiersmen, pirates, free black soldiers, and Creole aristocrats stood against the most powerful military force on earth, and somehow, impossibly, prevailed. The Battle of New Orleans was fought on January 8th, 1815, 15 days after the Treaty of Ghent had ended the War of 1812. Though neither army knew peace had been signed, the irony haunts every account. Blood spilled that need not have been spilled. Lives lost that need not have been lost. Yet the battle mattered enormously, shaped American identity for generations, launched Andrew Jackson toward the presidency, and demonstrated to the world that the young republic could defend itself against the mightiest empire of its age. We will explore this story not as military history alone, but as human experience. The fear and courage, the confusion and clarity, the strange alchemy that transforms ordinary people into defenders of something larger than themselves. We will walk the muddy ground where the rampart rose. Stand beside men who knew they were outnumbered. Feel the fog that shrouded both armies on the night before everything changed. The story is complicated, as all true stories are. Andrew Jackson, the hero of New Orleans, would later as president sign the Indian Removal Act, sending thousands of Native Americans to their deaths on the Trail of Tears. The free black soldiers who fought with extraordinary valor would see their contributions forgotten, their hopes for equality betrayed. The Baratarian pirates, who provided crucial artillery support, would return to outlawry when peacetime made their rehabilitation inconvenient. The victory that united a fractured nation was won by a coalition that the nation would soon fracture again. We hold these complications without resolving them. Honor the achievement while acknowledging its shadows. Remember the courage while mourning what followed. This is the only honest way to approach history. With gratitude for what was given and grief for what was taken, with wonder at human capability and humility about human failings. The Mississippi flows tonight as it flowed 2 centuries ago, carrying the sediment of continents toward the sea, carrying memory toward forgetting, carrying us toward understanding, if we are patient enough to follow its current. The Battle of New Orleans waits in the river's memory. The rampart still rises in imagination. The fog still parts to reveal what was risked and what was won. Let us begin. Let the evening deepen. And somewhere in the space between that January morning and our own time, between the smoke of battle and the silence of remembrance, let the story unfold as it wishes to be told. Slowly, completely, with respect for those who lived it and those who carry its consequences still. Now, let us descend to the river where empires converged, where a nation's fate trembled in the balance, where Andrew Jackson stood against the dawn and waited for the world to change. The Mississippi moves like memory itself, patient, inexorable, carrying the accumulated weight of continents toward the waiting sea. Before Andrew Jackson ever set foot upon its muddy banks, before cannon fire would shatter the morning stillness of January 1815, this river had witnessed the passage of empires that rose and faded like morning mist above its brown waters. The French planted their flags in the soft earth and called the land Louisiana for their sun king. The Spanish built their churches and whispered their prayers into humid air, thick with the promise of fortune. The native peoples who had called these waters sacred for millennia watched as strangers arrived bearing promises that would crumble like autumn leaves. The river cared nothing for flags or prayers or promises. It simply flowed, as it had flowed for ages beyond counting, draining 40% of the continent through its patient channel, depositing rich sediment that made the delta lands impossibly fertile, creating a waterway that whoever controlled would control the heartland of North America. This geographic truth shaped everything that followed. Nations fought for the Mississippi, not because of ideology or honor, but because of commerce, because of the fundamental reality that goods must move, and rivers are the oldest highways. New Orleans rose at the river's strategic crescent, positioned where ocean-going vessels could transfer their cargoes to riverboats heading upstream, where the wealth of the interior could flow toward markets across the sea. The city was French in its founding, Spanish in its development, American only since 1803, when Thomas Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase doubled the young nation's territory for the price of $15 million, roughly 4 cents per acre, for land that would prove beyond valuation. Napoleon, needing funds for European wars and recognizing he could not defend such distant territory, sold what he could not keep. America bought what it could scarcely comprehend. But purchasing territory and controlling territory were different matters entirely. By 1814, the War of 1812 had dragged on for 2 years. A confused conflict that Americans barely understood, fought against Britain for reasons that included impressment of American sailors, interference with American trade, and the persistent suspicion that British agents encouraged Native American resistance to American expansion. The war had gone badly. Washington had burned. The American invasion of Canada had failed. The young republic seemed overmatched against the empire it had escaped barely a generation before. And now that empire turned its attention southward. With Napoleon defeated and exiled to Elba, Britain could redirect its veteran armies toward finishing what the revolution had interrupted. New Orleans beckoned, the prize that would sever American access to the Mississippi, that would strangle Western commerce, that would demonstrate once and for all that the American experiment in self-governance was merely a temporary aberration in the natural order of imperial control. The city that waited for this onslaught was a place unlike anywhere else in America. French Creole aristocrats maintained their elegant townhouses and their contempt for the rough Americans who had purchased their homeland. Spanish architecture lined streets where French was spoken more commonly than English. Free people of color, gens de couleur libre, occupied a social position unknown in the rest of the slaveholding South. Owning property, practicing professions, forming a distinct community with its own traditions and pride. Enslaved people labored in the surrounding sugar plantations, their presence a constant reminder of the brutal economy that funded the city's refinement. Pirates and smugglers operated from the nearby Baratarian Islands, their contraband trade tolerated because it provided goods that legitimate commerce could not. This was the city that Andrew Jackson would be charged with defending. This fractured, polyglot, suspicious community that distrusted Americans almost as much as it feared the British. This strategic prize that both nations recognized as essential. This place where the river's patient flow had deposited not just sediment, but the accumulated complexities of colonial history, racial hierarchy, and commercial ambition. The winter of 1814 approached. British ships gathered in the Caribbean, loading soldiers who had defeated Napoleon's marshals, officers who had never known defeat, an army confident that the rabble defending New Orleans would scatter at the first disciplined volley. The empire prepared to reclaim what it had lost. The river continued flowing, indifferent to the struggles of the peoples along its banks, carrying the reflection of clouds toward the sea, carrying time itself toward the morning when everything would change. We close this chapter standing at the river's edge as evening settles over the delta. The cypress trees cast long shadows across water that holds the last light of day. Somewhere upstream, Andrew Jackson rides toward his appointment with destiny, his body weakened by dysentery and old wounds, his will harder than the iron he would soon deploy against Britain's finest. Somewhere across the ocean, transport ships load the soldiers who believe they will spend Christmas in conquered New Orleans. The river flows between these convergent fates, patient as always, knowing what humans cannot know, that the currents of history are about to meet in a collision that will echo through centuries. The Mississippi, the river that carried empires, the water that would soon reflect the flash of cannon fire and the fall of the proudest army in the world, the ancient flow that continues still, remembering what we struggle to imagine, carrying the sediment of that January morning toward a sea that receives all things and judges none. Before he was general, before he was president, before legend wrapped around his name like morning fog around Appalachian peaks, Andrew Jackson was a boy who learned grief early and never forgot its bitter taste. The Carolina backcountry of the 1760s offered little softness. Red clay soil that yielded crops only through relentless labor. Pine forests that stretched toward horizons no European had yet mapped. A frontier where survival was the first prayer of every dawn and the last gratitude of every dusk. Andrew was born in March 1767 in a log cabin somewhere along the border between North and South Carolina. The exact location disputed even then, claimed by both colonies, belonging fully to neither. His father, also named Andrew, had died just weeks before the birth, killed by an accident while clearing land, leaving Elizabeth Jackson to raise 3 sons alone in a world that offered widows few protections and fewer opportunities. She moved her family to relatives' land, worked as a housekeeper, held her boys together through will and faith, and the fierce determination that would prove her greatest inheritance to her youngest son. The Revolutionary War arrived in the Carolina backcountry not as distant news, but as immediate catastrophe. By 1780, when Andrew was 13, British forces had swept through the South, and the war became a brutal civil conflict where neighbor fought neighbor, where atrocities accumulated on both sides, where the distinction between soldier and civilian dissolved in flames and blood. Andrew's oldest brother Hugh died of heat exhaustion after the Battle of Stono Ferry. Andrew and his remaining brother Robert joined the local militia, children playing at war until war taught them what it truly meant. The education was savage. Captured by British forces in 1781, the brothers were held in a prison camp where smallpox spread through the crowded confines. When a British officer ordered Andrew to clean his boots, the boy refused. The officer's sword slashed across Andrew's head and hand, leaving scars he would carry for life. External marks of a wound that cut far deeper into his spirit. Robert died of smallpox shortly after their release. Elizabeth, who had travelled to Charleston to nurse American prisoners held on British ships, contracted cholera and died there, her body buried in an unmarked grave that her surviving son would never find. By 14, Andrew Jackson was alone in the world, orphaned, scarred, burning with a rage that would never fully cool, a hatred of the British that would fuel his military career decades later, an understanding of violence and loss and that would shape everything he became. The boy who emerged from the Revolution's crucible was not gentle, could not afford to be gentle, had learned that the world took what it wanted unless you were strong enough to stop it, that grief was a luxury the vulnerable could not afford, that survival required hardness of a particular kind. He drifted through his teenage years, inheriting a small sum from his grandfather in Ireland, spending it recklessly, teaching school briefly, studying law in Salisbury, North Carolina, reading enough to pass the bar examination in 1787. The frontier lawyer who emerged was tall, thin, red-haired, with a temper that became legendary, and a personal code of honor that demanded violent response to any perceived slight. He fought duels, he brawled, he accumulated enemies and allies in equal measure, both drawn by the same qualities. His absolute refusal to back down, his loyalty to those he considered friends, his merciless treatment of those he considered enemies. Tennessee called him westward. The territory was opening for settlement, needed lawyers to adjudicate the disputes that inevitably arose, offered opportunities for ambitious young men willing to risk frontier dangers for frontier rewards. Jackson arrived in Nashville in 1788, began building the practice and the reputation that would make him one of Tennessee's leading citizens. He married Rachel Donaldson Robards in circumstances that would later cause scandal. She believed her divorce from her first husband was final when it was not, creating technical bigamy that Jackson's political enemies would exploit for decades. The marriage, whatever its legal complications, was the emotional center of Jackson's life. Rachel was his anchor, his refuge from the storms of ambition and anger that drove him. The Hermitage, the plantation they built together outside Nashville, became his definition of home, the place he longed for during the long campaigns that would make his name. He loved her with an intensity that matched everything else about him, completely, fiercely, protectively. Her death in 1828, just weeks after his election to the presidency, devastated him in ways he never fully recovered from. He blamed his political enemies, whose attacks on Rachel's honor during the campaign he believed had killed her. The grief added another layer to the rage that had accumulated since boyhood. But in 1814, all that lay in the future. What mattered then was that Andrew Jackson had become Major General of the Tennessee Militia, had proved himself in brutal campaigns against the Creek Nation, had demonstrated a capacity for leadership that combined tactical intelligence with absolute determination. The Creek War of 1813 to 1814 had been merciless. Jackson's forces killed hundreds of Creek warriors at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, broke the power of the Red Stick faction, imposed a treaty that stripped the Creek Nation of 23 million acres. The methods were harsh. The results were effective. The reputation was established. When word came that British forces threatened New Orleans, Andrew Jackson was the obvious choice to lead the defense. He was already in the region, had already demonstrated his ability to command irregular forces, already possessed the iron will that the desperate situation would require. The boy forged in Carolina stone had become the man who would stand at the rampart, the orphan who had learned that the world showed no mercy, would show none to the empire that had taken everything from him. We close this chapter watching Jackson ride toward New Orleans in November 1814, his body ravaged by dysentery and the lingering effects of wounds received in duels and battles, his spirit undimmed by physical suffering. The man who approaches the Crescent City carries within him all the losses of his youth, all the rage accumulated across decades, all the determination that refuses to acknowledge impossible odds. The British do not know what they will face, cannot imagine the force of will concentrated in this gaunt figure on horseback. This man who has already survived what should have destroyed him, who has learned that survival requires fighting beyond the point where others surrender. The Carolina stone remains within him. It always will. And in the coming weeks, that stone will prove harder than anything the British Empire can throw against it. Across the Atlantic, in harbours where great wooden ships groaned against their moorings, the British Empire prepared to reach once more for what it had lost. The year 1814 had been triumphant for British arms. Napoleon defeated, Paris occupied, the Corsican tyrant exiled to the tiny island of Elba. The armies that had finally broken French power were now available for other purposes, and those purposes included finishing the unpleasant business with the former American colonies that had been dragging on since 1812. The soldiers who would sail for New Orleans were veterans of the Peninsular War, men who had marched across Spain and Portugal under Wellington's command, who had faced Napoleon's marshals and prevailed, who had learned their trade in the hardest school Europe could provide. They were professionals in the fullest sense, disciplined, experienced, confident in their training and their leadership. Many had served for years, had survived battles whose names would echo through military history. They represented the finest infantry the British Empire could field, and the Empire's confidence in their capability was absolute. Vice Admiral Sir Alexander Cochrane commanded the naval forces gathering in Jamaica, his fleet swelling with transport ships and warships as the expedition assembled. Major General Sir Edward Pakenham would command the land forces, though he had not yet arrived from England. His journey delayed by winter storms, and the assumption that the campaign would be straightforward enough to begin without him. Pakenham was Wellington's brother-in-law, a capable officer with extensive combat experience, expected to add another easy victory to his record before returning home with honours. The confidence was not baseless. British forces had already demonstrated their capability against American defenders. Washington had burned in August 1814, the American government fleeing before British regulars who met minimal effective resistance. The attack on Baltimore had been less successful. Fort McHenry held, inspiring Francis Scott Key to write the verses that would become the national anthem. But the overall pattern suggested that American forces could not stand against British regulars in pitched battle. The militia that formed the backbone of American defense had repeatedly broken when faced with disciplined volleys and bayonet charges. Why should New Orleans be different? The strategic importance was obvious. Control of New Orleans meant control of the Mississippi, and control of the Mississippi meant control of the American interior. Western farmers and merchants depended on the river to move their goods to market. Without access to New Orleans, the Western territories would be economically strangled, their connection to the rest of the nation severed. Even if the war ended with a negotiated peace, possession of New Orleans would provide leverage for territorial demands. Britain could potentially roll back the Louisiana Purchase, confine the Americans to the eastern seaboard, restore the balance of power that the Revolution had disturbed. The fleet that gathered in Jamaica was impressive by any standard. Warships to provide naval support, transport ships to carry the army, supply vessels to sustain the expedition. The soldiers loading onto these ships wrote letters home expressing confidence that Christmas would be celebrated in conquered New Orleans, that the campaign would be brief and glorious, that the Americans they would face were merely rebels who had temporarily escaped proper governance. The letters reveal the assumptions that would prove so costly. The belief that numbers and discipline would easily overcome whatever opposition they encountered. The dismissal of American military capability based on earlier encounters. The failure to imagine that anything might go wrong. Yet doubts existed, though they were seldom expressed openly. The Louisiana terrain was unknown and reportedly difficult. Swamps and marshes that would challenge movement. Diseases that killed more soldiers than enemy action. A landscape that favored defense over attack. The American commander was reportedly formidable, though details were scarce. The population of New Orleans itself was uncertain in its loyalties. French and Spanish inhabitants might welcome liberation from American rule, or they might resist for reasons of their own. The variables multiplied the further one looked, though confident officers preferred not to look too carefully. The fleet sailed in late November, carrying approximately 8,000 soldiers toward their destination. The crossing was not easy. Winter storms scattered the ships, delayed the arrival, gave the Americans precious additional time to prepare. When the fleet finally gathered off the Louisiana coast in December, the challenges of the terrain became immediately apparent. The coastline was a maze of islands, bayous, and shallow waters that large warships could not navigate. The army would have to land some distance from New Orleans and approach overland through country that maps barely depicted and that no British officer had ever seen. The preliminary operations went well enough. A flotilla of American gunboats defending Lake Bourne was overwhelmed on December 14th, removing one obstacle to the advance. The army began landing at Pea Island on December the 22nd, moving through the labyrinthine waterways towards solid ground. Soldiers who had marched across the dusty plains of Spain now trudged through knee-deep mud, their uniforms soaked, their morale maintained only by the promise of rich plunder waiting in the city ahead. New Orleans was said to be wealthy, was said to contain the accumulated commerce of the Mississippi, was said to offer rewards commensurate with the discomforts of the approach. By December 23rd, advance elements of the British force had reached the plantation of Jacques Villeray, just 8 miles from New Orleans. The surprise was nearly complete. The American defenders had not expected an approach from this direction, had not prepared adequately for the route the British had chosen. For a few hours, it seemed that the city might fall almost without a fight, that the confident predictions would prove accurate, that British discipline would once again triumph over American improvisation. Then, Andrew Jackson attacked. In a night action that demonstrated his aggressive temperament, Jackson struck the British camp before they could consolidate, before Pakenham had arrived to take command, before the full weight of British numbers could be brought to bear. The attack was not decisive. Both sides withdrew to regroup, but it sent a message that Cochrane and his officers had not expected. This would not be the easy conquest they had anticipated. The Americans would fight. We closed this chapter in the British camp on the morning of December 24th, watching soldiers who had expected to celebrate Christmas in luxury instead dig into defensive positions, suddenly aware that the campaign would be harder than they had imagined. General Pakenham has still not arrived. The American defenses are still unknown. The confidence that had filled the transport ships begins to give way to something more cautious, more uncertain. The Empire has crossed the water, but what waits on the far shore is not what they expected. The Mississippi flows nearby, indifferent to the armies gathering along its banks. The egrets rise at dawn, as they have risen for millennia. And somewhere in New Orleans, Andrew Jackson begins building the rampart that will turn confidence to carnage. New Orleans in December 1814 was a city that should not have been able to defend itself. The regular American army presence was minimal. The militia was poorly trained and uncertain in loyalty. The population was divided by language, culture, and resentments accumulated across decades of changing sovereignty. The terrain that made the city strategically vital also made it difficult to defend. Approachable from multiple directions, surrounded by waterways that offered avenues of attack, lacking natural defensive positions that might offset the defenders' numerical disadvantage. Andrew Jackson arrived on December the 1st to find chaos that would have paralyzed a lesser commander. The Louisiana militia was barely organized. The political leadership was suspicious of this rough Tennessean who had been given authority over their city. Supplies were inadequate. Intelligence about British intentions was fragmentary and often contradictory. The time available to prepare defenses was desperately short, weeks at most before the enemy would appear. Everything needed to be done simultaneously, and nothing was ready. Yet Jackson possessed qualities that chaos could not diminish. His will was absolute. His energy, despite the physical ailments that would have confined lesser men to bed, was boundless. His ability to inspire confidence in others, to make them believe that victory was possible despite evidence suggesting otherwise, transformed the situation with remarkable speed. Within days of his arrival, he had declared martial law, assumed direct control of the city's defense, and begun the process of assembling the most improbable army in American history. The components of that army reflected New Orleans' unique social complexity. Free men of color, gens de couleur libre, formed 2 battalions of militia that would prove among the most effective units in the coming battle. These were men who occupied an ambiguous position in American society, neither enslaved nor fully free, possessing rights in Louisiana that they would not have enjoyed elsewhere in the slave-holding South. Jackson's decision to arm them and integrate them into his defensive plans was controversial but pragmatic. He needed every soldier he could find, and these men had demonstrated their willingness to fight. The Baratarian pirates presented a different kind of opportunity and a different kind of risk. Jean Lafitte and his brother Pierre operated from the islands and bayous south of New Orleans, leading a smuggling operation that provided the city with goods that legitimate commerce could not supply. The British had already approached Lafitte, offering money and British naval rank in exchange for his support. Lafitte had instead passed the British offer to American authorities, possibly from patriotic sentiment, possibly because he calculated that an American victory would better serve his long-term interests. Jackson initially rejected any association with the pirates, calling them hellish banditti. But the Baratarians possessed something the American defense desperately needed: artillery and the skilled gunners to operate it. The negotiation that brought the Baratarians into American service demonstrated Jackson's pragmatic flexibility beneath his rigid exterior. In exchange for pardons for past crimes, Lafitte's men would provide cannons, powder, flints, and, crucially, experienced artillerists who had learned their trade in ways the respectable preferred not to examine. The pirates knew the bayou country better than any American officer. They could handle heavy guns with skill that regular soldiers could not match. Their contribution would prove essential. Tennessee and Kentucky provided the riflemen who would form the backbone of the defensive line. These men were different from the regulars and militiamen of the eastern states. Frontier hunters who had grown up with rifles in their hands, who could hit targets at distances that smoothbore muskets could not reach, who fought as individuals rather than as disciplined formations. Their accuracy was legendary, their discipline minimal, their willingness to follow orders dependent on respect rather than obedience. Jackson understood them because he was one of them, a frontiersman who had risen to command but had never forgotten where he came from. Choctaw warriors joined the defensive force, bringing knowledge of the terrain that no map could provide. Their alliance with the Americans was complicated by the long history of conflict between native peoples and American expansion, but immediate interests aligned against the common British threat. The Choctaw scouts would prove invaluable in the confused fighting through swamps and bayous that preceded the main engagement. Regular army units were present but few. The 7th Infantry Regiment, some artillery companies, fragments of other units that had been scraped together from garrisons across the region. These professionals provided a core of discipline and training that anchored the irregular forces surrounding them. Their officers brought tactical knowledge that frontier militia lacked. Their steadiness under fire would help steady the less experienced troops positioned alongside them. The assembly came together with remarkable speed. Men who would never have spoken to each other in peacetime found themselves standing in the same defensive lines, bound by the common threat that made their differences temporarily irrelevant. French-speaking Creoles stood beside English-speaking Kentuckians. Free men of color positioned themselves next to slaveholders. Pirates who had evaded the law for years served alongside the soldiers who would have arrested them a month before. The coalition made no sense by any normal social logic. It made perfect sense by the logic of survival. Jackson reviewed his forces and found them inadequate by conventional military standards. Too few, too poorly trained, too diverse in capability and motivation. He reviewed them again and found them sufficient for the task at hand. These men would fight because they had everything to lose. Their homes, their families, their city. They would fight because the alternative was unthinkable. They would fight because Andrew Jackson told them they would fight, and his certainty was contagious. We close this chapter on the evening of December 27th, watching the unlikely army take its positions along the Rodriguez Canal. The rampart is still incomplete. The enemy is close. The fog begins rolling in from the river, wrapping the world in veils of grey that obscure the boundary between what is and what might be. Tomorrow's fate remains uncertain. But tonight, the gathering is complete. Pirates beside priests, free men beside enslaved, frontiersmen beside aristocrats. The coalition that should not exist prepares to defend a city that should not be defensible. And in the darkness, the sound of distant British drums suggests that the test is coming. Whatever happens next, these unlikely defenders will face it together. Between Christmas and the New Year, something emerged from the Louisiana earth, a defensive line built from the very swamp that surrounded it, a wall of mud and timber that would determine the fate of a continent. The Rodriguez Canal had been nothing more than a drainage ditch, a shallow excavation marking the boundary between two plantations. Andrew Jackson saw what it could become, the anchor for a defensive position that would multiply his outnumbered forces, that would transform the open ground before it into a killing field no army could cross. The work began in desperate haste. Every available hand was conscripted. Soldiers and civilians, free men and enslaved, anyone capable of wielding a shovel or carrying a load of earth. The canal was deepened and widened, creating a wet ditch that would slow any attacking force. The excavated earth was piled on the southern bank, forming a parapet that grew higher with each passing day. Cypress logs were embedded in the earthwork, providing additional protection and stability. Cotton bales, commandeered from nearby plantations, were rolled into position to absorb enemy fire, though they would later prove less effective than hoped. The work continued through rain and cold, through exhaustion that accumulated with each sleepless night. The Mississippi River anchored the right flank of the line, its deep waters impassable to infantry, its presence ensuring that the British could not turn that end of the American position. The left flank rested on a cypress swamp, its tangled vegetation equally impassable, its mosquito-haunted waters providing protection no artificial fortification could match. Between river and swamp, the rampart stretched for about 1,000 yards, the only ground the British could attack, the only avenue to the city they sought to capture. Artillery positions were carved into the rampart at intervals, their placement determined by the Barratarian gunners. who would serve the heavy guns. These men understood angles of fire, understood how to position cannons for maximum effect, understood the mathematics of destruction in ways that regular army artillerists appreciated and learned from. The guns themselves were a miscellaneous collection. Ships' cannons from the American naval vessels in the harbor, field pieces from army stores, weapons captured from the British in earlier skirmishes, guns provided by Lafitte's pirates from sources best left unexamined. The variety complicated ammunition supply, but provided firepower that Jackson had not expected to possess. The rampart rose higher as the days passed. 4 feet, 5 feet, eventually reaching 8 feet in places, high enough that attackers would have to climb under fire, exposed to defenders who would be protected by the earth they had piled. Firing steps were constructed behind the parapet, allowing riflemen to stand and shoot before ducking below the protective barrier to reload. The Kentucky and Tennessee, long rifles that many defenders carried, could reach targets at 200 yards or more, distances at which British smoothbore muskets were merely noisy rather than lethal. The British probed the American defenses during this construction period, testing for weaknesses, assessing what they faced. On December 28th, they advanced in force, hoping to break through before the fortifications were complete. American artillery drove them back, demonstrating for the first time the firepower advantage that Lafitte's guns provided. On January 1st, a massive British bombardment attempted to silence the American cannons and breach the rampart. The bombardment failed. The earthwork absorbed the cannonballs that would have shattered stone walls. The American gunners replied with devastating accuracy. The expected advance found no gap to exploit. The British withdrew to reconsider. General Pakenham had finally arrived and assumed command, finding a situation more difficult than he had anticipated. The American position was stronger than intelligence had suggested. The direct approach, a frontal assault across open ground, was clearly costly, but alternatives were limited. The swamp that protected the American left flank also prevented flanking movements. The river that anchored the American right could theoretically be crossed, but transporting enough troops across required preparation that consumed precious time. Every choice of delay allowed the American defenses to grow stronger. The soldiers who built the rampart understood what they were creating, even if they lacked the strategic vocabulary to explain it. They were building their survival into the mud, shaping the earth into protection that British courage alone could not overcome. The work was hard, was monotonous, was essential. Men who had never touched a shovel before Christmas became expert earthworkers by New Year's. The blisters healed into calluses. The exhaustion became normal. The rampart rose. We close this chapter standing atop the completed fortification on the evening of January 7th, looking south toward the British camp. Thousands of enemy soldiers wait in the darkness. preparing for the assault that everyone knows is coming. The rampart seems impossibly fragile against the force that will be thrown against it. Mere mud and logs against disciplined veterans who have defeated Napoleon's finest. Yet the rampart stands. The cannons are loaded. The riflemen know their positions. The unlikely army has done everything possible to prepare. Tomorrow will test whether preparation is enough. Tomorrow will reveal whether mud and courage can turn back an empire. The rampart waits, patient as the earth from which it rose, ready to receive what morning will bring. The defenders find what rest they can, and in the silence before storm, the work of human hands stands against the darkness. A line drawn in Louisiana mud that says, "This far and no further." January 7th, 1815. The night before, everything changed. The hours of waiting, the strange suspension between peace and violence when time seems to thicken like Louisiana humidity, and every sound carries significance beyond its cause. The fog rolled in from the river as evening deepened, wrapping the world in soft grey veils that muffled sound and blurred the boundary between earth and sky, between what was certain and what remained unknown. The American defenders occupied their positions along the rampart, some sleeping in the exhausted fashion of soldiers who have learned to rest whenever opportunity permits. Others staring into the darkness where the enemy waited. The night was cold, cold by Louisiana standards, at least, and many men shivered in clothing inadequate for the damp air that penetrated everything. Small fires flickered behind the lines where regulations permitted, offering warmth that seemed insufficient against the chill that came not just from the weather, but from the knowledge of what dawn would bring. Andrew Jackson moved along the rampart, checking positions, speaking with officers, projecting the confidence that his role required regardless of what he actually felt. His body had been failing for weeks. The dysentery that had plagued him throughout the campaign, the old wounds that ached in the cold, the accumulated exhaustion of driving himself beyond physical limits that would have stopped other men. But his will remained absolute, and that will now focused on the coming battle with an intensity that made his physical condition irrelevant. He would stand. He would fight. He would not permit defeat. The conversations along the line were quiet, intimate, in the way that darkness permits. Men who had never spoken to each other before found themselves sharing tobacco, sharing memories, sharing fears they would have denied in daylight. A Creole gentleman who had never fired a shot in anger listened to a Kentucky rifleman describe hunting deer in the forests of his childhood. A free man of color checked the mechanism of his musket beside a white officer who 3 weeks earlier would have considered such proximity unthinkable. A Baratarian pirate explained the finer points of artillery loading to a regular army private who had never seen a cannon fired. The fog created its own reality, isolating small groups within its veils, making the world seem both smaller and larger than it actually was. Sounds carried strangely. A cough might seem to come from yards away or from miles. The distant stamp of horses in the British camp might be clear one moment and inaudible the next. The uncertainty was its own kind of tension, adding to the anxiety that sleeplessness and anticipation had already produced. Men saw shapes in the mist that might be anything or nothing. Across the field, separated by less than a mile of open ground that might as well have been an ocean, the British camp hummed with final preparations. Officers studied maps that showed them little they did not already know. Soldiers checked their equipment for the 100th time, the familiar routine providing comfort against the unfamiliar fear that even veterans felt before battle. The assault was scheduled for early morning, time to catch the Americans in the confusion of dawn, to close the distance before the deadly rifles could take their full toll. The plan was straightforward, too straightforward. Some officers worried, though discipline prevented them from saying so publicly. 3 columns would advance across the open ground, absorbing whatever casualties the artillery inflicted, reaching the rampart, scaling it with ladders and fascines, breaking through to the city beyond. The plan assumed that American defenders would break under pressure, as American militia had broken before. The plan assumed that British discipline would overcome American firepower. The plan assumed many things that the next morning would test. General Pakenham moved among his men as Jackson moved among his, performing the same rituals of command, projecting the same necessary confidence. He was concerned. The terrain favored defense. The American position was stronger than he had hoped. The casualties would certainly be significant, but concern could not alter the strategic necessity. New Orleans must be taken. The assault must proceed. The morning must bring victory, or it would bring disaster. There was no middle ground. The hours passed. The fog shifted, but did not lift. Prayers were whispered in English and French and Spanish, in languages whose speakers would soon face each other across the killing ground. Some men slept, many could not. The cold deepened toward midnight, toward the small hours when even the most determined wakefulness surrenders to exhaustion, toward the grey pre-dawn when the world hangs suspended between darkness and light. At 4 a.m, the British columns began to form. Quietly, with the discipline born of years of campaigning, soldiers found their positions, checked their weapons one final time, waited for the signal to advance. The fog remained, obscuring their movements from American sentries who strained to hear or see any indication of what was coming. The drums were silent. Surprise remained essential, or at least the hope of surprise. The rockets that would signal the attack were not yet fired. We closed this chapter in the last moment before dawn, the fog still thick, the silence almost complete. Two armies face each other across ground that will soon be transformed by violence. The defenders behind their rampart cannot see what approaches. The attackers forming their columns cannot see what awaits. Both sides know that when the fog lifts, everything will change. The sacred pause, the breath held between heartbeats, the stillness before thunder. In this suspended moment, the future remains unwritten. Victory and defeat are both possible. Life and death hang in a balance so delicate that a single decision, a single shot, a single gust of wind might tip it either way. The night has passed. The morning approaches. And somewhere in the fog, destiny waits to reveal itself. January 8th, 1815. The fog lifted like a stage curtain, revealing columns of red-coated soldiers advancing in formations so perfect they might have been on parade, their ranks dressed as if for inspection, their bayonets glinting in the first light of morning. For a moment that seemed suspended outside of time, the American defenders watched this magnificent display of military precision cross the open ground before them. Then the cannons spoke, and the moment shattered into chaos. The first salvos tore through the British formations with devastating effect. The Barratarian gunners, who had spent their lives learning how to aim and fire heavy weapons, demonstrated their expertise with terrible efficiency. Cannonballs carved lanes through the advancing ranks, sending men flying, disrupting the careful alignment that British doctrine required. The columns closed up, stepped over fallen comrades, continued advancing, discipline holding even as death harvested their numbers. The range closed. The Kentucky and Tennessee riflemen, positioned along the rampart with weapons that could reach targets far beyond musket range, began their work. They fired from protected positions, ducked below the parapet to reload, rose again to find new targets. Officers were particularly vulnerable. Their positions at the head of formations, their distinctive uniforms, made them easy marks for marksmen who had spent their lives hunting for survival. British officers fell in numbers that no army could sustain. General Samuel Gibbs, commanding the main assault column, was hit early and carried from the field. General John Keane was wounded trying to rally his men. The command structure disintegrated as the officers who should have directed the advance became casualties themselves. Soldiers who had been trained to follow orders found themselves without anyone to give orders, advancing into fire that seemed to intensify with every step, dying in numbers that exceeded anything the survivors could later fully comprehend. General Pakenham rode forward to restore order, to inspire by his presence the advance that seemed to be faltering. It was the act of a brave commander, the choice that military tradition honored and that the situation seemed to require. A burst of grape shot struck him, mortally wounding the commander who had expected to spend this night celebrating victory in captured New Orleans. He was carried from the field. dying before he could reach the surgeons. His confident plans dying with him. The assault on the American right, near the river, achieved temporary success. A column under Colonel Robert Rennie reached the rampart, briefly planted British colours on the American fortification, seemed for a moment to threaten a breakthrough, but Rennie fell, shot through the head, and the soldiers who had followed him found themselves in an impossible position, atop the rampart, but without support, surrounded by defenders who had recovered from the initial shock and now poured fire into the exposed redcoats. The breakthrough collapsed. The survivors retreated or died. The fog of war, not the meteorological fog that had shrouded the night, but the chaos and confusion that accompanies all combat, made it impossible for anyone to comprehend the full picture of what was happening. Americans behind the rampart saw only the segments of the battlefield before their positions. British soldiers in the advancing columns saw only the ground immediately ahead and the comrades falling beside them. The commanding generals on both sides lacked the omniscient perspective that later historians would construct. They responded to fragments of information, to sounds and sights that might or might not indicate what was actually occurring. What was occurring was slaughter on a scale that neither side had anticipated. The British formations, so impressive in their discipline, became merely excellent targets for artillery and rifle fire that cut them down in windrows. The advance continued. British soldiers were not trained to retreat merely because circumstances became difficult. But the purpose of the advance was being consumed by its cost. Each yard gained toward the rampart cost dozens of lives. The bodies accumulated until they formed obstacles themselves, barriers that following ranks had to climb over to continue advancing. After perhaps 25 minutes of concentrated killing, the British assault collapsed, not in a dramatic moment of decision, but in the gradual recognition that further advance was impossible, that the officers who should have given orders were dead or wounded, that continuing meant dying without possibility of success. Soldiers began falling back, at first in groups, then in larger numbers, then in a retreat that preserved order but acknowledged defeat. The American fire continued as the British withdrew, adding to casualties that were already catastrophic. When the firing finally stopped, when the smoke began to clear, and the reality of what had happened became visible, both sides struggled to comprehend the magnitude. The open ground before the rampart was covered with red-coated bodies. The dead, the wounded, the dying. British casualties would eventually be calculated at over 2,000. Killed, wounded, missing, captured. American casualties were fewer than 70. The disparity defied belief, seemed almost miraculous to the Americans, who had expected a hard fight and had instead witnessed annihilation. The rampart that had seemed so fragile against the weight of the British attack had proved impervious, had performed exactly as Jackson had designed it to perform, had converted British courage into British corpses with industrial efficiency. The battle that was supposed to be the first step in the conquest of New Orleans had become instead one of the most lopsided defeats in British military history. We close this chapter as the last echoes of gunfire fade, as the moans of the wounded rise from the field, as the living try to understand what they have witnessed. The morning that echoed forever has ended, but its echoes have only begun. The reverberations will reach across the nation, will shape politics and identity for generations, will transform Andrew Jackson from military commander into national legend. The fog is gone. The smoke drifts slowly across the broken bodies. The rampart stands, mud-built and blood-christened, testament to what preparation and courage and fortune can achieve. The morning, January 8th, 1815, forever etched in American memory. Forever the moment when an unlikely army turned back an empire. In the aftermath of battle, a different kind of truth emerges. The smoke clears, the firing stops, and what remains is the terrible mathematics of what has occurred. The bodies, the wounds, the grief that will ripple outward from this Louisiana field to villages in Britain and homesteads in Tennessee and places that have never heard of New Orleans, but will learn its name through the absence of those who will not return. The American defenders stood behind their rampart in something like shock, surveying a field that their fire had transformed into a charnel ground. The British dead lay in heaps where artillery had caught concentrated formations. They lay scattered where individual soldiers had fallen to rifle fire while trying to advance. They lay tangled with the wounded, whose cries rose in a continuous lamentation that would haunt survivors for years afterward. The scale of destruction exceeded anything most Americans had witnessed, exceeded what they had believed their weapons capable of producing. Andrew Jackson walked the rampart, speaking to the men who had done this thing, acknowledging their service in his rough way, projecting the satisfaction that the occasion required, even as he recognized that the victory was not yet complete. The British Army remained in the field, reduced but not destroyed, capable of regrouping and potentially attempting another assault. But for this moment, he permitted himself and his men to recognize what they had achieved. The Empire's finest had marched against them, and they had held. Behind the British lines, the surviving officers struggled to restore order to an army that had lost its commanding general and much of its command structure. General John Lambert, third in seniority, found himself in charge of forces that had been shattered in a single morning. Forces that still faced an enemy position they could not overcome with the resources remaining. The decision was not difficult. There would be no second assault. The British would withdraw, would evacuate their dead and wounded where possible, would abandon the campaign that had begun with such confidence weeks before. The flag of truce appeared within hours. White cloth signaling the desire to recover the dead, to attend to the wounded who lay between the lines. The American defenders watched as British soldiers emerged to carry their fallen comrades from the killing ground, performing the ancient ritual of honoring the dead that transcended the enmity that had made them dead in the first place. The American guns remained silent, permitting the work that decency required. The burials that followed were hasty by necessity. The January weather was mild by British standards, but warm enough to make rapid interment essential. Shallow graves received officers whose bodies would later be exhumed and returned to England. Mass graves received the common soldiers who had followed those officers across the fatal ground. The Louisiana earth absorbed the blood and the bodies, beginning the process of reclamation that would eventually erase most physical traces of what had occurred, leaving only memory and monument. But before the burials were complete, before the British withdrawal began, there was the matter of the wounded. Hundreds of men whose injuries required treatment that neither army was fully equipped to provide. The screaming had given way to moaning, had given way to the silence of those who had already died or who were dying beyond any help that medicine of that era could offer. The surgeons on both sides worked without rest, amputating shattered limbs, probing for musket balls, doing what limited science and unlimited determination could accomplish. Among the American defenders, the casualties were so few as to seem providential. The rampart had done its work, had protected those behind it from the fire that should have taken far greater toll. Men who had expected to die found themselves alive, found themselves unable to fully process the transformation from anticipation of death to the fact of survival. Some wept, some prayed, some simply stared at the field before them, trying to comprehend what had happened and why they had been spared when so many had not. The coalition that had seemed so improbable, pirates and priests, freemen of color and slaveholders, frontiersmen and aristocrats, had held together through the supreme test. The differences that would reassert themselves in peacetime remained submerged in the shared experience of having faced death together and having prevailed. For this moment, at least, they were comrades. The bonds forged in battle would fade as ordinary life resumed, but they would never entirely disappear. Men would remember, decades later, who had stood beside them on that morning. We close this chapter as evening settles over the battlefield, as the last work of burying and treating concludes for the day, as the American defenders finally permit themselves to believe that the immediate crisis has passed. The British Army still waits in the distance, but its threat has been revealed as hollow, its power broken on the mud-built rampart. Tomorrow will bring further negotiations, further withdrawals, the gradual return to something resembling normal existence. But tonight, the field holds its dead. The silence that has settled is not peace, not quite yet, but the exhausted pause between violence and recovery. The stars emerge above the Louisiana landscape, indifferent to what occurred beneath them, eternal witnesses to human folly and human courage in equal measure. The battle is over. The morning has begun. And somewhere in the darkness, the meaning of what happened starts its long journey toward understanding. Across the young nation, in cities and villages that had heard only rumors of distant conflict, the weeks following the battle passed in anxious uncertainty. News traveled at the speed of horses and ships, which meant that the most momentous events remained unknown for days or weeks after they occurred. The citizens of Philadelphia and New York and Boston could not know what had happened at New Orleans until messengers completed journeys that consumed time the way fire consumes oxygen, steadily, inexorably, with no way to hurry the consumption. The context of this waiting was despair. The war had gone badly for America. Washington had burned. Negotiations at Ghent seemed stalled. The British Army gathering at Jamaica suggested offensives that the American military seemed unable to counter. Pessimism was not merely justified, but seemed the only rational response to the accumulating evidence that the war had been a mistake, that the young republic had overreached, that the consequences of that overreach were about to be paid in territorial losses and national humiliation. Then the messengers arrived. The news of New Orleans swept across the nation like wildfire through dry prairie, like revelation after long darkness, like the transformation from despair to jubilation that only unexpected deliverance can provide. The details emerged in fragments. Jackson's rampart, the British assault, the impossible casualty figures that seemed too one-sided to be credible. But the central fact was clear. The American defenders had held. The empire had been repulsed. The city remained in American hands. The celebration was immediate and immense. Church bells rang in cities from Boston to Savannah. Crowds gathered spontaneously to toast the victory, to cheer the names of Jackson and his unlikely coalition, to feel the surge of national pride that the war had denied them until this moment. The magnitude of the victory, the disparity between British and American losses, the failure of the empire's best troops against frontier militia, became proof of American virtue, evidence that the Republic possessed qualities that mere numbers could not measure. The coincidence of timing amplified the emotional impact beyond what the military result alone would have justified. News of the Treaty of Ghent, signed on December the 24th, 2 weeks before the battle, arrived in America almost simultaneously with news of the victory. The war was over. Peace had been signed. And in the final act of a conflict that had produced mostly disappointment, American arms had achieved a triumph that no one had expected. The irony that the battle had been unnecessary, that the peace treaty meant the fighting should never have occurred, was largely ignored in the celebration. The blood spilled at New Orleans had purchased nothing in diplomatic terms. The war's outcome had been determined in Ghent, not in Louisiana. But this logical observation seemed almost irrelevant against the emotional reality that the nation had witnessed a great victory at the moment when it most needed one. Andrew Jackson became the beneficiary of this emotional calculus. His name, already known, became suddenly famous in a way that transformed him from regional figure to national hero. The stories multiplied and grew in the telling. Jackson's iron will, his refusal to surrender, his transformation of a rabble into an army that humiliated the conquerors of Napoleon. The stories were not entirely false, but they smoothed away complexities, simplified motivations, created the legend that history would remember, while the reality faded into footnotes. The celebration contained elements that later generations would find troubling. The victory was achieved in part through the labor of enslaved people who had built the fortifications, whose contributions were erased from the celebratory narrative. The free black soldiers who had fought with distinction received brief acknowledgement that was soon forgotten. The Baratarian pirates whose guns had proved essential were pardoned, but not honored. Their role in the victory was awkward for a nation that preferred its heroes respectable. The coalition that had won the battle was dissolved almost before the celebration ended, its components returning to the social positions that peace maintained. But none of this dimmed the immediate joy. The nation that had doubted itself found in New Orleans confirmation of its capabilities. The republic that had wondered whether it could survive found evidence that it possessed the strength to defend itself against the greatest military power on earth. The victory provided what the nation needed: a story it could tell itself about who it was and what it could accomplish. We close this chapter watching the celebration spread across the country, watching the news transform communities that had lived in fear into communities that could believe in themselves again. The messengers have completed their journeys. The news has arrived. And in the receiving of that news, the nation begins to understand what New Orleans will mean. Not just a battle won, but a myth created, a legend born, a story that will shape American identity for generations to come. The slow travel of news has given way to the rapid spread of celebration. The uncertainty has resolved into jubilation. And somewhere between the fact of what occurred and the story that will be told about it, the truth begins its transformation into legend. In the years that followed, something happened to the memory of New Orleans. It grew, transformed, became something larger than the battle itself. Something that served purposes the actual participants could never have intended. Andrew Jackson. The military commander became Andrew Jackson the symbol. Embodiment of democratic virtue triumphing over aristocratic pretension. Common man defeating trained professionals. Frontier wisdom overcoming old world sophistication. The transformation was not entirely spontaneous. Jackson himself participated in shaping his image, emphasizing aspects of his background that resonated with the emerging democratic politics of the Jacksonian era while minimizing others that might complicate the narrative. He was the orphan who had risen by his own merit, the frontiersman who had never forgotten his origins, the man of the people who understood their concerns because he shared them. These characterizations were not false, but they were selective. presenting the facets of a complex personality that best served political purposes. The presidency followed inevitably from the legend. Jackson's campaigns for the office, unsuccessful in 1824, triumphant in 1828 and 1832, mobilized the emotional connection that New Orleans had created. The voters who supported him were not merely choosing policies, they were affirming an identity, declaring that men like Jackson, rough, self-made, unbowed by establishment disapproval, represented what America was and should be. The victory at New Orleans had demonstrated that such men could prevail against seemingly superior opponents. The presidency would demonstrate that such men could govern. The legend served purposes beyond Jackson's personal ambition. It provided the nation with a founding myth appropriate to its democratic aspirations, a story that emphasized individual courage and collective determination over aristocratic privilege and military professionalism. The American victory became proof that the American way was superior, that the values of the Republic produced results that monarchy could not match. The story was told and retold, simplified with each telling, until the complexities that complicated the narrative were smoothed away entirely. But legends cast shadows, and Jackson's shadow was darker than the celebratory narrative acknowledged. The same qualities that made him effective at New Orleans, his absolute determination, his refusal to compromise, his willingness to use violence in pursuit of his goals, produce catastrophe when directed against those he considered enemies. The Native American peoples who had occupied the lands that American expansion coveted found in Jackson not a defender, but a destroyer. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 formalized what Jackson's policies had already begun: the forced relocation of native peoples from their ancestral lands to territories west of the Mississippi. The Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Seminole, nations that had lived on these lands for generations, that had developed complex societies, that had in some cases fought alongside Americans in wars including the defense of New Orleans, were compelled to leave on journeys that killed thousands. The Trail of Tears became the name for this forced migration, a name that captured something of the grief and suffering that removal inflicted. Jackson justified removal in language that combined paternalism with practicality, claiming that separation from white settlement was necessary for native people's survival, that the lands in the West would be theirs forever, that the policy reflected concern for native welfare rather than merely desire for native lands. The justifications were not believed even when they were offered. They seem even more hollow in retrospect, when the history of subsequent Western expansion revealed that no land would be safe from American appetite, that forever meant only until circumstances changed. The contradiction sits at the heart of Jackson's legacy and at the heart of American identity. The man who defended New Orleans, who preserved the Republic against external threat, also threatened and destroyed the peoples who had lived on this continent before the Republic existed. The hero contains the villain, The legend requires acknowledgement of what the legend obscures. The question of how to remember Jackson has no comfortable answer. To celebrate only the victory at New Orleans is to ignore the Trail of Tears. To condemn only Indian removal is to ignore the genuine courage and capability that the battle demonstrated. To resolve the contradiction by declaring Jackson simply good or simply evil is to oversimplify what history teaches. That human beings contain multitudes, that the same will that achieves great things can accomplish terrible things, that heroism and cruelty are not always as separate as we would wish. We close this chapter contemplating the statue of Jackson that stands in New Orleans' Jackson Square, the general astride a rearing horse, hat raised in triumph, the gesture frozen in bronze for the centuries. The statue captures the legend, the confidence, the authority, the sense of destiny fulfilled. It does not capture the complexities that the legend suppresses, the costs that the victory concealed, the darkness that accompanied the light. The smoke of the battlefield has long since cleared. The legend has risen in its place, and those who remember must choose how to remember, whether to accept the legend as it was constructed or to insist on the fuller truth that legends typically obscure. The choice is not easy, but honesty requires making it. New Orleans carries the battle's memory differently than the rest of America. The city where it happened holds the history in ways that national narrative cannot contain, ways that emerge from specific streets and buildings and traditions, ways that acknowledge what the broader story often forgets. Walk through the French Quarter today, and you walk through layers of history that the battle barely touched, but profoundly affected. The Creole culture that the American victory preserved continued developing in ways that might have differed under continued French or British rule. The architecture, the cuisine, the music, the particular blend of influences that makes New Orleans unique. All of this owes something to the outcome of January 8th, 1815, though the connections are complex and indirect. The battlefield itself has been transformed. Chalmette is now a national historical park, its grounds maintained by the National Park Service, its interpretive programs attempting to convey what occurred to visitors who arrive with varying levels of prior knowledge. The rampart has been partially reconstructed, its dimensions marked for those who wish to understand the defensive position that proved so effective. The monuments acknowledge the victory, while the visitor center attempts to provide context. The causes of the war, the composition of the defending force, the consequences of the outcome. But the official commemoration tells only part of the story. The descendants of those who fought carry memories that official history does not always include. The families of the free men of color who served with distinction remember ancestors whose contributions were acknowledged briefly and then forgotten, whose hopes that military service would secure full citizenship were betrayed by the peace that followed. The descendants of enslaved people who built the fortifications remember labor that received no recognition, sacrifice that purchased nothing for those who made it. The Baratarian connection remains ambiguous in local memory. Jean Lafitte achieved a peculiar immortality, celebrated as patriot for his contribution to the defense, romanticized as pirate for the colorful life that preceded and followed it. His story has been told and retold until the historical figure has been largely replaced by the legend, the smuggler and slaver, transformed into the dashing privateer of popular imagination. New Orleans, which has always been comfortable with complexity and contradiction, embraces this ambiguous hero in ways that more straightforward communities might not. The music that emerged from New Orleans in the century following the battle owes something to the cultural preservation that the victory enabled. The African rhythms that would eventually become jazz were able to develop in New Orleans' particular environment, where enslaved people had more opportunity for cultural expression than in other parts of the slave-holding South, where the traditions that would transform American music could take root and grow. The connection between the battle and the blues is indirect but real. Both emerged from the same cultural matrix. Both reflect the complexity that makes New Orleans unique. The city remembers in its bones, in ways that conscious memory cannot fully capture. The Mississippi still flows past where the rampart stood. The cypress swamps still mark the boundaries where the battle could not be fought. The aigrettes still rise at dusk, as they did 2 centuries ago, indifferent to the human dramas that occurred beneath their flight. Something of that January morning lingers in the air, available to those who pause and listen, who open themselves to the presence of the past that the present cannot entirely erase. The annual commemoration brings together those who wish to remember, reenactors in period costume fire muskets and cannons, attempting to convey something of what the original participants experienced. Historians offer lectures explaining what happened and why it mattered. Descendants of the defenders sometimes attend, maintaining connection to ancestors whose names they carry and whose service they honor. But the commemoration is always incomplete, always selective in what it remembers and what it forgets. The full story, including the parts that make celebration complicated, requires more than ceremony can provide. It requires the patient work of understanding, the willingness to acknowledge complexity, the refusal to simplify what history has made complex. We close this chapter walking the streets of New Orleans as evening falls, as the city that hosts the memory of the battle comes alive with lights and music, and the particular energy that makes it unlike anywhere else in America. The battle happened here. The victory was won here. And here, more than anywhere else, the memory persists. Complicated, contested, carried forward by a city that has always been comfortable with complications, that holds all the versions of the story and refuses to choose among them. New Orleans remembers. and its memory is richer than any single telling can capture. We close where we began, beside the river that carried empires, beneath stars that watched the battle's fury and the peace that followed. This final chapter is meditation more than narrative, reflection on what the Battle of New Orleans teaches those willing to sit with its complexity, to receive its gifts, and acknowledge its burdens. The Mississippi still flows. As it flowed before humans settled along its banks, as it will flow after whatever we build along its banks has crumbled into the sediment it carries toward the sea. The river cares nothing for our commemorations, our interpretations, our need to find meaning in what occurred along its waters. It simply flows, patient and eternal. Reminder that the human stories we tell are episodes in a longer narrative we cannot fully comprehend. What remains when the smoke clears and the legends fade and the history books settle into their authoritative conclusions? Perhaps only questions. Why do nations remember some battles and forget others? What determines which events become foundational myths and which are relegated to footnotes? How do heroes contain darkness and light in equal measure? And how should we respond to that containment? The Battle of New Orleans mattered. This is beyond reasonable dispute. It secured American control of the Mississippi at a moment when that control was genuinely threatened. It demonstrated to the world that the young republic could defend itself, that American military capability was not merely the temporary advantage of revolution, but a permanent feature of the nation's character. It launched Andrew Jackson toward the presidency, shaping American politics for a generation. It provided a founding myth that the nation needed, a story it could tell itself about who it was and what it could accomplish. But the battle's meaning exceeds these political calculations. It speaks to something deeper about human nature, about the capacity for courage when courage seems futile, about the possibility of unity among people who had no reason to trust each other, about the way that crisis can reveal strengths that ordinary times conceal. The defenders of New Orleans did not know they would win. They knew only that they had to fight, that the alternative to fighting was unacceptable, that whatever happened, they would face it together. The coalition that held the rampart was temporary. It dissolved almost before the celebration ended, its components returning to the social divisions that peace maintained. But for that morning, it existed. For those crucial hours, the differences that normally divided people became less important than the danger that threatened all of them equally. The memory of that unity persists as possibility. Evidence that human beings can sometimes transcend the categories that separate them, even if the transcendence is temporary and the categories reassert themselves when the crisis passes. The darkness in the story persists as well. The victory was won in part by enslaved labor that received no freedom in return. The triumph of American arms led directly to American expansion that destroyed native nations and broke every promise made to them. The hero of New Orleans became the architect of the Trail of Tears. The celebration of democratic virtue coexisted with the preservation of slavery that contradicted everything democracy claimed to mean. These complications do not erase the achievement, but they qualify it in ways that honest remembrance must acknowledge. The Battle of New Orleans was not a simple story of good defeating evil. It was a complex event embedded in complex contexts, producing consequences that included both things we should celebrate and things we should mourn. The only honest response is to hold both, to honor the courage without ignoring the cost, to celebrate the unity without forgetting what divided, to remember the victory without forgetting what the victor would later do. We stand at Chalmette as evening descends, watching shadows lengthen across the peaceful field. The cannons are silent replicas now. The rampart has been reconstructed for visitors who try to imagine what cannot truly be imagined. The terror, the courage, the impossible noise of combat, and the deeper silence that followed. The park closes soon. The visitors will depart. The field will hold its ghosts alone through the night. What do the dead seek of us? Perhaps only that we remember them honestly, not as legends simplified for political purposes, not as symbols stripped of their humanity, but as people who faced what they faced and did what they did and deserve to be understood in their full complexity. The British soldiers who died advancing across the killing ground were brave men serving their country as they understood their duty. The American defenders who killed them were brave men defending their homes as they understood their duty. The tragedy is that both can be true simultaneously, that courage exists on both sides of every conflict, that the enemies we fight are rarely the monsters our propaganda requires. The river flows. The city lights come on in the distance. The stars emerge. The same stars that shone on that January morning. Indifferent then as now to human struggles. Eternal witnesses to our temporary ambitions. The Battle of New Orleans recedes into history, becoming each year more distant, more difficult to imagine, more subject to the simplifications that time imposes on everything it touches. But the questions remain. The complexity persists. And for those who pause at the battlefield as darkness gathers, who open themselves to the silence where history breathes, something of that morning is still available. Not the facts alone, which books can provide, but the presence, the weight, the significance that transcends factual accounting. Sleep now. The story has been told, and in the telling, something has been honored. Not Jackson alone, not America alone, but the strange and terrible and beautiful way that history moves through time, carrying all of us toward futures we cannot foresee, asking us to remember with honesty what those who came before endured and achieved and failed to achieve. The dawn scrolls close, the river flows on, and somewhere between the battle's smoke and our own breathing, the morning of January 8th, 1815, continues echoing, continues teaching, continues asking what we have learned and what we will do with our learning. The silence breathes, the river flows, and dawn, as always, prepares to break again. Conclusion. Where dawn breaks forever, the chronicle closes, but dawn continues breaking, always breaking, never fully arrived. The Battle of New Orleans recedes into the past at the same rate that all events recede, becoming each year more distant, more subject to the simplifications that memory imposes, more available for the uses that each generation finds for history's raw material. We have walked the muddy rampart, stood with the unlikely defenders, felt the fog lift to reveal what approached. We have witnessed the assault and the slaughter, the victory and its celebration, the legend rising from the smoke of battle. We have acknowledged the complexities that celebration typically ignores. The enslaved labor, the forgotten contributions, the darkness that accompanied the light. We have tried to hold the contradiction without resolving it prematurely, to honor what deserves honor, while mourning what deserves mourning. What remains is not conclusion, but continuation. The questions that New Orleans raises about heroism and its shadows, about unity and its limits, about the stories nations tell themselves and the truths those stories obscure. These questions persist. They persist because they are not questions about the past alone, but about the present and the future, about who we are and who we wish to become, about what we will remember and what we will choose to forget. The Mississippi flows tonight as it flowed 2 centuries ago, carrying the sediment of continents toward the sea, carrying memory toward forgetting, carrying us toward understanding, if we are patient enough to follow its current. The battle happened. The victory was won. The consequences unfolded in ways that included both glory and grief. And now the memory passes to those who inherit it, who must decide what to do with what they have received. Sleep well. Dream of the rampart rising from Louisiana mud, of the unlikely coalition that held against the empire's best, of the morning when everything changed. Dream also of the costs that victory exacted, of the promises broken and the peoples displaced, of the truth that heroism is rarely simple and that honest remembrance requires acknowledging complexity. The Battle of New Orleans, the morning that echoed forever, the story that shaped a nation's understanding of itself, forever part of who America is, for better and for worse, forever asking whether we can learn from what happened, whether we can keep the courage while rejecting the cruelty, whether we can honor the unity while building something more durable than crisis can create, whether we can remember honestly enough to deserve what we inherit. The dawn scrolls close, the night deepens, and somewhere between waking and sleeping, between remembering and forgetting, the ancient battle whispers still, reminding us of what was achieved, warning us of what was lost, teaching us that history is not merely past but present, not merely story but inheritance, not merely memory but responsibility. Good night. Sleep deeply and wake, remembering that you too are part of this long story, that the choices you make continue the work that began on that Louisiana field, that each generation must decide anew what to remember and what to do with its remembering. The silence breathes, the river flows, and dawn, forever breaking, calls us to whatever morning brings.